The weeks after Seralia's decision passed with a quiet but powerful energy. News of the Queen's choice had spread to every corner of the empire. At first, it was only whispers. Farmers in far-off provinces spoke of the Queen who cared for even the smallest colonies. Traders in distant markets repeated the story, each time adding new details about the human who had stood at her side. And soon, even those who had doubted her began to see that something unusual was happening. For the colony itself, the change was life-saving. The aid ships arrived just as hunger had begun to break spirits. Supplies were shared, tools distributed, and advisors sent to help restore the soil. But more than food or resources, the people received something deeper, the knowledge that they had not been forgotten. They began to work with new strength, not because they suddenly had more, but because their queen had chosen them when others would not. Letters of thanks, messages of loyalty, and songs of praise began flowing back to the capital. The empire, which had seemed to Daniel like a machine of logic and order, now pulsed with something warmer. A new voice was rising among the people. Hope. Daniel saw all of this from the palace. He was not a ruler, not even a citizen, yet somehow, he had become part of the story. Wherever he walked, eyes followed him with curiosity. Some still questioned why he was there, but many more looked at him with quiet respect. In their eyes, he was not simply a guest. He was the human who had reminded their queen of compassion. One evening, Seralia called Daniel to join her in the grand hall. The chamber was filled with light from tall crystal lanterns and banners hung from the walls, each one carrying the symbol of her empire. The council was gathered, though their expressions were calmer now than in weeks past. Something important was about to happen. When Seralia entered, the room fell silent. She wore robes of soft silver and blue, her crown glinting faintly with starlight. She moved with the quiet grace of someone who carried both authority and humility. "My people," she began, her voice steady and clear. "You know of the choice I made weeks ago. You know of the protests, the doubts, and the fears that followed. But now you also know of the colony's survival. You know they live, they work, and they thrive again. And you know it is because compassion was chosen over calculation." Her words stirred the room. Some of the council looked uneasy, but many lowered their heads in thought. "This empire has long been built on reason and order," she continued. "We believed these alone would keep us strong. But strength is not only in fleets, in resources, or in numbers. True strength is also in trust, in loyalty, in the bond between ruler and people. And bonds are not forged by logic alone. They are forged by compassion." She paused, her gaze sweeping the chamber. "I did not learn this truth from our history, nor from our laws. I learned it long ago, on a day when my life was saved by someone who had nothing to gain. A human boy who gave his hand not because it made sense, but because it was right. That same human stands beside me today, and though he is not of our kind, his voice has reminded me of what it means to rule not as a machine, but as a heart." She turned toward Daniel, her eyes shining. "Daniel, my friend, the empire owes you more than it knows." The chamber stirred with surprise. Some gasps echoed softly, but no one spoke against her. For in their queen's words, they heard not weakness but conviction. Daniel felt his throat tighten. He had never imagined his name would be spoken in such a hall, much less in such a way. He lowered his head, not knowing what to say, but Seralia gave him a gentle smile as if to say no words were needed. That night, when the ceremony ended and the council departed, Seralia and Daniel walked together in the quiet gardens. The stars were bright above them, and the pools reflected their glow like scattered jewels. "You spoke of me in front of all of them," Daniel said softly, still amazed. "Why should I not?" Seralia replied. "You are part of this story, as much as I am. You gave me courage when I was surrounded by doubt." Daniel shook his head slightly. "I only reminded you of what you already knew." She smiled faintly. "And yet without reminders, even a queen can forget." They walked in silence for a while, the gentle sound of water and wind filling the air. Then Seralia stopped and turned to him. "Daniel," she said, her voice quieter now. "When I was young and you saved me, I thought of you often after we were parted. I wondered if I would ever see you again. And when I did, all these years later, I found you had not changed in the way that mattered. You were still the same human who reached out his hand without thought of reward. That is why you are precious. Not for what you know or what you own, but for what you carry inside you." Daniel felt his chest tighten again, but this time it was not from nervousness. It was from the weight of her words, words he would carry for the rest of his life. As the days passed, the empire began to shift in quiet but undeniable ways. Laws were reviewed with new compassion. Councils debated not only on efficiency but on fairness. Colonies once ignored began to receive visits and support. People began to believe that their queen ruled not only with her mind but with her heart. Daniel often walked among the people, listening to their voices. They greeted him kindly now, some even bowing slightly in respect. Children pointed to him, whispering that he was the human who had reminded their queen of mercy. Daniel always smiled, though he felt humbled by it. He knew he was just an ordinary man, yet somehow that ordinariness had mattered. One morning, Seralia asked him to accompany her on a journey. Together, they traveled to the very colony she had saved. The world was small and humble, its towns simple compared to the capital, but when their ship landed, the people gathered in celebration. They cheered their queen, but they also turned their eyes toward Daniel. He walked with Seralia through the streets, feeling the warmth of their gratitude. Families pressed forward to thank them. Farmers offered simple gifts of fruit and bread. Children laughed and sang. It was not riches or splendor, but it was real. In one small village, an old woman clasped Seralia's hands and said with tears in her eyes, "You remembered us. When we thought we were forgotten, you remembered." Those words stayed with Daniel more than anything else. It was not about fleets or wealth. It was about being remembered. That, he realized, was the true heart of leadership. When they returned to the capital, Seralia gathered her people once more. This time it was not only the council but representatives from across the empire. She stood before them, her voice strong. "Today we mark the beginning of a new way," she declared. "An empire not only of strength but of compassion. We will not turn from those in need. We will not forget those who are small. For in lifting the weakest, we become stronger together. This is the path forward, and this is the legacy we will leave." The hall thundered with voices, some in surprise, some in support. But no one could deny that something had changed. The empire was not the same as it had been weeks before. It had been touched by something rare, something unexpected: humanity. That night, when all was quiet again, Daniel stood once more on the balcony beside Seralia. The city stretched below, alive with light. "Do you see it?" she asked softly. Daniel tilted his head. "See what?" "The future," she said. "A future that is brighter because of you." Daniel smiled faintly. "Because of us." She turned to him, her eyes glowing with warmth. "Yes, because of us." They stood together, in silence, the stars watching over them. One a queen, the other a human who had once been just a boy. Their lives had crossed by chance, but their bond had changed an empire. And as Daniel gazed at the endless sky, he thought of something he had once believed, that being human was ordinary, but now he knew better. Humanity was not ordinary at all. It was extraordinary, and its light could reach even the farthest stars. The palace felt like a dream to Daniel, a place that belonged more to stories than to reality. Every wall was alive with light. Every corridor hummed with quiet music from unseen instruments, and every hall carried the scent of flowers that opened only at night. Yet despite all the beauty, Daniel soon discovered that life inside the palace was not as peaceful as it seemed. Queen Seralia carried herself with grace. To her people she was calm, composed, and wise. But Daniel, who had once seen her frightened and small, could sense the strain hidden behind her steady voice. He began to notice the little signs when they walked together, or spoke in quiet rooms away from her advisors. The way she paused before answering questions. the moments when her gaze wandered toward the stars, as if searching for something beyond the palace walls, the faint sighs she released when she thought no one was listening. Daniel did not want to intrude, but Seralia seemed to want him near. She often called him to join her at meals, to sit beside her when she reviewed reports, or simply to walk the gardens in the evening. Her attendants were puzzled by her choice. A human, in their eyes, was unremarkable. Most humans lived far from the empire, building small colonies and trading quietly with other species. To place one so close to the throne seemed unnecessary, even dangerous. The council made their feelings known soon enough. One morning, Daniel was invited, more accurately summoned, to attend a council session. The chamber was vast, with curved seats arranged like waves rising around a central floor. Advisors from many noble houses filled the rows, their robes colored with family symbols, their faces stern. At the center stood Queen Seralia, tall and composed, her crown glimmering faintly under the chamber's lights. Daniel took a seat at her side, uncertain if he belonged there. Whispers spread quickly through the council. The sight of a human, seated beside the queen, was a shock that no one had prepared for. One elder advisor, his voice calm but sharp, finally spoke. "Your Majesty, we cannot understand why this outsider is granted such closeness. With all respect, a human cannot guide the empire. Their species has no great fleets, no vast knowledge, no history of power. Why is he here?" Daniel felt heat rise in his face. He was not offended, not exactly. It was true that humanity was small compared to the empire, but the directness of the words left him exposed. He turned his eyes to Seralia, unsure how she would respond. The queen's voice was clear. "He is here because I trust him. You ask what power humans have? I tell you, they have the power to care when there is nothing to gain. They have the power to act when others hesitate. This human once saved me when no one else could. That is why he has a place here." The chamber grew restless. Some whispered in disagreement, others remained silent, perhaps thinking of her words. Daniel wished he could disappear, but Seralia's hand rested gently against the arm of his chair, grounding him. The session continued, filled with discussions about trade, resource disputes, and distant colonies. Daniel tried to follow, though the details often escaped him. He noticed that the advisors measured everything in numbers: resources gained, strength maintained, power extended. Their arguments were sharp, logical, and often cold. When they debated the fate of a struggling mining colony, the voices carried no warmth. The colony produced little, cost much, and seemed unimportant to the empire's strength. Many argued it should be abandoned. Daniel listened in silence, his hands tightening. He remembered the mining towns of early human colonies, dusty settlements where people worked with little, hoping to build something better for their children. He could almost hear the voices of those miners, tired but determined, holding on, not because of numbers but because of hope. When Seralia asked the council for their final opinions, Daniel spoke before he could stop himself. "Forgive me," he said quietly, "but I don't think you should leave them." The chamber fell, silent. Every eye turned to him. Daniel swallowed, his voice trembling but firm. "I've seen small colonies. To outsiders they look weak, useless even. But for the people who live there, it's everything. It's their home, their family, their future. If you leave them, you don't just lose a colony. You take away their hope." The advisors looked unimpressed. One replied sharply, "Hope does not fuel ships. Hope does not fill granaries." Daniel nodded slowly. "Maybe not. But hope keeps people alive when nothing else does. And when they survive, they build. And what they build lasts longer than numbers on a page." The council murmured, dismissive. But Seralia's gaze remained on him, her eyes shining with quiet pride. She did not force his words on the council, but neither did she silence him. Instead, she ended the session with calm authority, leaving the matter unresolved for the moment. Afterward, in the quiet of the palace gardens, Seralia turned to him. "You spoke well." Daniel shook his head. I probably made a fool of myself. They think I'm just a simple human. Her smile was gentle. Simple does not mean foolish. What you said was true. They do not see it. Not yet. But I do. For a moment, Daniel felt a weight lift from him. He was still uncertain why he mattered so much here, but her faith made him believe, even just a little, that his voice carried meaning. Over the next days, Daniel saw more of the weight Seralia carried. The council pressed her constantly, on decisions of trade, defense, expansion. They pushed for strength, for control, for wealth. Rarely did they speak of compassion. Yet Seralia listened to them all, her expression calm, her answers thoughtful. In private, however, Daniel could see the toll. One evening they sat by a pool of glowing water, its surface reflecting the stars above. Seralia removed her crown and set it gently beside her. Without it, she seemed less a queen and more the girl he remembered, though her posture still held dignity. They see my compassion as weakness, she admitted softly. Every day I must prove that caring does not mean failing. But sometimes... Her voice trailed off and she looked at the water as if searching for courage. Sometimes I wonder if I can carry both, the crown and my heart. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, then he said, When I saved you back then, I wasn't thinking about strength or weakness. I wasn't thinking about gain or loss. I just couldn't leave you there. It wasn't a choice I measured, it was just right. She turned her gaze to him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. Maybe that's the difference, Daniel continued. Your counsel measures everything, but sometimes the right choice isn't something you can measure. Sometimes it's just something you feel. Her lips curved into a soft smile. That is why you are here. You remind me of what they cannot see. The night stretched on, filled with gentle silence. Daniel realized that though Seralia was a queen, surrounded by power and knowledge, she still carried loneliness. She needed not another advisor filled with numbers and logic, but someone who could remind her of the simple truths. As the days passed, Daniel found himself drawn deeper into her world. He attended ceremonies, listened to debates, walked through gardens, and even shared meals in the grand halls. Everywhere he went, he felt the stares of others, curious, doubtful, sometimes even cold. But Seralia's presence shielded him. She never wavered in her trust, never allowed others to treat him as less. Slowly, Daniel began to understand. She did not call him here to solve her empire's problems with knowledge or power. She called him because she needed a reminder of humanity, the very thing her empire risked forgetting. And though he often doubted himself, Daniel began to realize that sometimes the smallest voice, speaking from the heart, could be louder than the grandest counsel. Daniel never imagined that his days in the palace would change the way he thought about himself. In the beginning, he had felt like an outsider, an ordinary man among rulers, scientists, and leaders whose decisions shaped whole worlds. Yet as time passed, he began to notice that Seralia leaned on him in ways she did not lean on anyone else. She would ask his opinion on matters that seemed far beyond his reach, and though he often hesitated, she listened carefully to every word he spoke. For Seralia, Daniel was more than a reminder of her childhood rescue. He was a living example of something her council struggled to understand: the unmeasured values of humanity. To her council, worth was counted in numbers, strategies, and resources. To Daniel, worth lived in stories, in feelings, in the small choices that gave life meaning. One morning, Seralia invited Daniel to join her in the council chamber again. The advisors were restless that day, their voices raised in debate. A distant colony, small and struggling, had requested help after a season of storms ruined their crops. The council reviewed the request with cold precision. They provide nothing of value to the empire, one advisor argued. Why waste resources on them? They are weak, another said. If they cannot survive alone, they should not survive at all. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He looked at Seralia, who sat calmly, her hands folded in her lap. She did not interrupt, though her eyes carried a quiet sadness. Finally, she turned, to Daniel. "What do you think?" The entire chamber stilled. Dozens of eyes turned toward him. He felt the weight of their stares pressing on him, but Saralia's calm expression gave him courage. "I think you should help them," he said softly. The advisors erupted in murmurs. Some laughed quietly, others shook their heads. Daniel continued, his voice growing stronger. "I know you measure everything by gain and loss. You think helping them will cost too much. But maybe you should think about what you cannot measure. If you help them now, you give them more than food. You give them a reason to believe they are not forgotten. That belief can grow stronger than any storm." One advisor leaned forward sharply. "Words of hope are meaningless. Hope does not plant crops. Hope does not feed mouths." Daniel nodded. "Maybe not. But I've seen people survive on hope when nothing else was left. And when they survive, they work harder, they build, and one day they give back more than anyone expected. Sometimes the smallest kindness today becomes the greatest strength tomorrow." The chamber fell into silence again. The advisors looked unconvinced, but Saralia's lips curved into a faint smile. "Your words are simple," she told him quietly, "but they are true." The matter was left unresolved, but Daniel knew he had planted a seed. Over the next weeks, Saralia invited him to more gatherings. Sometimes it was a council meeting, sometimes a cultural ceremony, sometimes a quiet meal with noble families. Each time, Daniel noticed how different he was from everyone else. The nobles spoke with polished formality, their words wrapped in layers of meaning. Daniel spoke plainly, often too plainly, but his honesty carried weight. He would tell stories of human colonies, of people who celebrated even in hardship, of parents who worked long hours just to see their children smile. At first, the nobles dismissed him as unsophisticated. But slowly, something began to shift. They listened longer, asked more questions, and though they often disagreed, they could not ignore the warmth in his stories. One evening, Saralia arranged a private gathering in a smaller chamber. A few trusted advisors sat with her, their faces curious. Daniel was asked to speak about humanity, not about politics or trade, but about what made his people who they were. He thought carefully before answering. Then he began. "Humans are not the strongest," he said. "We are not the smartest, not compared to all the species I have met. Our ships are small, our world scattered. But we have something that keeps us going. We tell stories. We dream about tomorrow even when today is hard. We help strangers for no reason at all, and somehow that makes us stronger." He paused, then smiled faintly. "When I was young, my grandmother used to tell me stories every night. She said stories were like stars. Even when everything is dark, they give you something to follow. Humans live by those stars. That's how we survive." The advisors exchanged glances. Some seemed puzzled, others thoughtful. Saralia leaned forward, her eyes bright. "Stories as stars," she repeated softly. A simple thought, but beautiful. Daniel shrugged. "Maybe simple things are the strongest. We don't always need grand plans to find our way. Sometimes we just need something small to believe in." One advisor finally spoke. "Perhaps there is wisdom in this simplicity. Our empire has forgotten the value of small things." For the first time, Daniel felt a shift. His words were not just being tolerated, they were being considered. Later, when the gathering ended, Saralia walked with him through the palace halls. Her smile was gentle, her voice soft. "You see, Daniel, they are beginning to hear you. They may not admit it yet, but your words reach them in ways their own logic cannot." Daniel shook his head. "I only speak what I know. I don't have the wisdom of your people." "Wisdom takes many forms," Saralia said. "And sometimes the simplest form is the one we need most, Shako." Days grew into weeks and Daniel's role in the palace deepened. He was still not an official advisor, not part of the council, but his presence became impossible to ignore. When disputes grew too sharp, Saralia would glance at him, and though he often felt unprepared, he spoke honestly. His answers were not always solutions, but they reminded everyone that beneath their arguments were living people, with hopes and fears. Slowly, Daniel realized that this was why Seralia had called him here. Not to solve her empire's problems with power or knowledge, but to remind her and her people that compassion and hope were as valuable as strength and numbers. One night, Seralia invited Daniel to a balcony overlooking the city. The lights of the capital shimmered like a sea of stars below them. She stood beside him, her crown glimmering faintly in the moonlight. "When I was young," she said softly, "I was taught that rulers must be unshakable. That emotion is weakness, that compassion leads to ruin. But the day you saved me, you showed me something different. You risked yourself without reason, without gain. That memory shaped my path. Now, standing here as queen, I still carry it." Daniel listened quietly. "You are not just my friend," Seralia continued. "You are proof that compassion is not weakness. It is strength. And I want my people to see that, even if it takes time." Her words filled Daniel with a quiet warmth. He had never thought of himself as special, yet here he was, shaping the thoughts of an empire simply by being human. As the night wind stirred their robes, Seralia turned to him with a smile. "The council believes strength comes from control, but I believe true strength comes from kindness. And you, Daniel, are my reminder of that truth." For the first time since arriving at the palace, Daniel no longer felt like an outsider. He felt like he belonged, not because of power or status, but because of the simple humanity he carried with him. And deep inside, he began to sense that his presence here was not just about the past, but about the future of an entire empire. The weeks passed, and Daniel began to feel the rhythm of palace life. Each morning the council gathered in their great chamber, voices rising and falling like waves. Each afternoon, Seralia attended ceremonies or visited places within the capital where her people lived and worked. And each evening she often called Daniel to walk with her in the gardens or sit by the glowing pools where the air smelled of blossoms and starlight. Though he tried to stay humble, Daniel could not ignore how much she leaned on him. She asked for his thoughts on questions that seemed far too large for one man. She wanted to know what humanity would do, how humans thought, how humans made choices when they had so little, and yet still found ways to survive. But all of this calm was leading toward something heavier. Daniel could feel it in the palace air. Advisors grew sharper in their words. Council sessions stretched longer, and Seralia's eyes grew more thoughtful each night. Something important was coming. The moment arrived on a bright morning when the council chamber filled with unusual urgency. Even Daniel could sense the weight of the news before Seralia began to speak. A distant colony of the empire had fallen into crisis. The world was small, its population scattered in farming settlements. A sudden climate shift had ruined the soil, leaving the people without food and without the means to restore their land. Messages had reached the palace begging for help, but the colony was far from the capital and sending aid would be costly. The council wasted no time in their arguments. "It is a loss to keep them," one advisor declared. "The colony has little strategic value. No rich minerals, no great trade routes. Resources are limited," another said. "We cannot send ships and supplies only to prop up failure." Others nodded, their voices weaving together into a chorus of logic and calculation. Daniel sat quietly at Seralia's side, watching her face. She listened to them all with calm dignity, but he could see the storm behind her eyes. He knew she remembered the people on that colony not as numbers or statistics, but as lives, each with dreams and families. Finally, one advisor turned sharply toward her. "Your Majesty, we must decide. Do we waste strength on weakness, or do we secure our resources for colonies that truly matter?" The chamber stilled. All eyes turned to Seralia. For a long moment she was silent. Then slowly she turned her gaze to Daniel. "What does humanity say?" she asked softly. The question sent a ripple of surprise through the chamber. The advisors whispered to one another, their voices sharp with disbelief. To them, it was unthinkable that a human outsider would be asked to speak in such a critical matter. Daniel felt his heart pound. He wanted to shrink from their stares to stay silent, but Soralya's eyes held him steady. She was asking not as a queen commanding a subject, but as a friend seeking truth. He drew a slow breath. "In my people's history," Daniel began, his voice quiet but clear, "we have faced times when small towns or villages were struck by disaster. Sometimes they had nothing left. No crops, no strength, no future anyone could see. And always there were those who said, 'Leave them. Save your strength for others.' But we didn't always listen to that voice. Sometimes we chose to help, even when it made no sense. We shared what little we had. We stayed when it was easier to leave. And often those places grew stronger than anyone imagined, not because they were rich or powerful, but because they remembered that someone cared." The advisors looked unimpressed. One leaned forward, his tone sharp. "That is a romantic tale, nothing more. Compassion does not build fleets." Daniel nodded. "Maybe it doesn't. But fleets do not build loyalty. Fleets do not make people believe in you. Compassion does that. And when people believe, they stand with you even in your hardest times. That is worth more than numbers." The chamber grew quiet. Daniel felt exposed, but he saw Soralya's lips curve into a faint smile. She rose slowly from her seat, her robes flowing like silver water. Her voice carried through the hall, steady and unshaken. "The council has spoken of loss, of weakness, of waste. But I say this, strength is not measured only in what we take. It is measured also in what we give. A ruler who abandons her people for the sake of numbers may gain resources, but she loses something far greater, the trust of those she rules. I will not abandon them. We will send aid." The council erupted into protests. Voices rose, sharp and angry. Reckless. A mistake. A drain on the empire. But Soralya lifted her hand and silence fell. "You call it weakness, I call it strength. This is my decision. The colony will not be left to die." Her words echoed through the chamber like a bell. The advisors fell silent, their expressions stiff with disapproval, but none dared to argue further. The decision had been made. When the session ended, Soralya left the chamber with Daniel at her side. Once they were alone in the quiet of the palace halls, she let out a soft breath. "They will not forgive me easily for this," she said quietly, "but I could not choose otherwise." Daniel looked at her with quiet admiration. "You chose what was right, not what was easy." She smiled faintly. "Perhaps that is something I learned from a human long ago." In the days that followed, preparations for aid began. Ships were loaded with food, tools, and supplies. Volunteers stepped forward, inspired by the Queen's decision, eager to help their fellow citizens. News of the choice spread quickly through the empire. Some criticized her, saying she was wasting resources, but many more admired her, speaking of her compassion, her courage, and her willingness to stand by even the smallest colony. Daniel watched it all unfold with awe. He realized that this was more than a single decision. It was a message to the entire empire. A message that compassion had a place in leadership, that rulers did not stand apart from their people but with them. One evening, Soralya asked Daniel to join her again on the balcony overlooking the city. The air was cool, and the lights of the capital shimmered below. She stood quietly for a while, her crown glinting faintly in the starlight. "You see how they look at me now," she said softly. "Some with admiration, some with doubt. I do not know what the future will bring, but I know this. I could not rule as they wished me to. I must rule as my heart tells me." Daniel nodded. "And that is why they will follow you. Even those who doubt you now will one day see the strength in what you've done." Her gaze turned to him, her eyes shining with gratitude. "You do not realize how much your presence has meant. You remind me that compassion is not weakness, that hope is not foolish. Without you, I might have listened to their voices, but because of you, I remembered mine. Daniel felt a warmth in his chest. Though he could not find the right words to answer, he simply stood beside her, watching the city lights flicker like stars. For a long time they stood in silence. Two figures on a balcony, one a queen, the other an ordinary human. Yet in that moment, Daniel felt that his simple presence had shaped the course of an empire. And deep within him, he realized something he had never believed before. Perhaps being human was not ordinary at all. Daniel never thought the past would follow him across the stars. He had lived many years among distant colonies, traveling between worlds as a quiet observer, a human who was curious about cultures beyond his own. He was not a soldier, not a diplomat, not even a famous explorer. He had always thought of himself as ordinary, just someone who happened to wander too far from home. Yet the universe had a way of remembering even the smallest actions, and one act of kindness from long ago had returned to him now, greater than anything he could have imagined. The invitation came suddenly. It was a message that appeared on his small ship's communication screen, written in the formal flowing script of the alien empire. At first he thought it was a mistake. Why would an empire so vast, so filled with knowledge and power, send a direct invitation to a lone human traveler? The message carried the royal seal, the kind he had only seen in news broadcasts and ancient archives. It spoke of a formal reception, a ceremony that demanded his presence. His name was spelled perfectly, his location identified with precision. Daniel hesitated. He had visited many planets, but he had never once been called before a throne. Still, curiosity guided him more than fear. He set his course for the grand capital of the empire, a place few humans had ever seen with their own eyes. The journey itself was filled with wonder. As his ship descended, the capital planet opened before him like a jewel suspended in the dark. Its surface shimmered with seas of silver, mountain peaks that glowed with minerals, and cities built like spirals of glass and light. Countless ships from different species circled above, each following strict paths guided by elegant patterns of energy beacons. To Daniel, it looked less like a planet and more like a living constellation. When his ship touched the landing platform, he expected guards, interrogations, or at least a long wait. Instead, attendants greeted him politely, their voices calm and their movements graceful. They seemed to know exactly who he was. Without asking questions, they escorted him through shimmering corridors filled with murals that told the empire's history, victories, discoveries, rulers long gone. Daniel tried to make sense of why he was here, but no answer came. Finally, they led him into the heart of the palace. The hall was vast, its ceiling so high that it disappeared into mist. Crystals hung like stars glowing softly above. Columns carved with flowing shapes lined the room, and a wide path of white stone stretched toward a throne at the far end. Daniel felt very small as he walked, each step echoing in the silence. The throne was unlike anything he had expected. It was not made of gold or metal, but of living crystal that seemed to breathe with light, and upon it sat a figure draped in flowing robes of silver and blue, a crown of faintly glowing threads resting upon her head. Her posture was calm, her eyes steady as she looked at him. At first he thought she was simply another ruler, another alien queen among many. But then she rose from her seat and her eyes widened and Daniel's heart froze. He knew her. Not as a queen, not as a ruler, not as someone above him. He knew her as the frightened child he had once carried to safety, all those years ago. The memory was so vivid that it seemed to rise before his eyes. He remembered the dusty outpost where he had been stranded, the sudden tremor that had shaken the ground, the collapse of a structure where a small alien girl had been trapped. He had run without thinking, lifting the broken beams, pulling her free, and carrying her until they both found safety. She had looked at him with wide, uncertain eyes as if she had never seen anyone risk so much for a stranger. He had spoken to her softly, telling her it would be all right, even though he himself had been trembling, and then she had been taken away by others of her kind, disappearing into the crowd. He had never expected to see her again. Yet here she was, no longer a child, no longer helpless. She stood tall, with the dignity of a ruler, but when her gaze locked onto his, he saw the same spark of recognition. For a moment, the grand hall, the guards, the attendants, all of it disappeared. It was just her and him, the memory between them filling the space more strongly than any ceremony. "Daniel," she said, her voice carrying through the hall, clear and steady. "You came." The sound of his name spoken in her language was perfect, shaped with care. He almost forgot to bow, but her smile softened the moment. I wasn't sure why I was called," Daniel admitted, his voice quiet but honest. "But now I think I understand." The queen stepped down from the throne, her robes flowing like water behind her. Every attendant watched silently, some with surprise, some with disapproval. No ruler was meant to descend so freely, but she ignored them. She stopped only a short distance away, her eyes never leaving his. "Many years have passed," she said, "but I have not forgotten. A frightened girl once thought she would be lost forever, and then a human, a stranger, carried her into the light." Her voice softened. "That moment shaped me more than you know." Daniel felt warmth rise in his chest, though he was still overwhelmed. He wanted to say it was nothing, that anyone would have done the same, but he knew that was not true. The way her eyes shone told him that his choice had mattered, that it had set a path not only for her, but for everything around her. "I never thought it meant so much," he said quietly. "It meant everything," she replied. The hall was still silent, but the air itself seemed to change. The queen turned to her attendants and advisors. "This human is not a guest. He is not a visitor. He is a friend of the throne." Whispers spread among the attendants, their voices hushed but urgent. To grant such honor to a human was unheard of, yet Daniel stood still, unsure how to carry such weight. He had come expecting curiosity, perhaps suspicion, but not this. As the ceremony continued, the queen introduced him formally, her words filled with respect. She told her court of the day she had been saved, of the kindness that had expected no reward, of the lesson she had carried into her reign, that compassion was strength, not weakness. The hall listened, some reluctantly, some with wonder. Daniel could feel their eyes on him, but he kept his gaze on her. When the formalities ended, she invited him to walk with her through the palace gardens. The gardens were vast, filled with plants that glowed faintly under the evening sky, their petals opening as if to drink the starlight. She walked beside him, not as a queen above her subject, but as someone who remembered. "You must have wondered why I called you here," she said softly. Daniel nodded. "I did. I thought it was a mistake. I never expected this." Her expression grew thoughtful. "Ruling is not what I imagined. Power is not enough. Knowledge is not enough. My people are strong, but they forget what it means to care for the small, the weak, the forgotten. That is why I remembered you, because you reminded me of something greater than power." He listened, humbled. He had never considered himself wise or important, yet to her his act had become a symbol. As they walked, she told him of her struggles, of advisors who valued only strength, of rivals who doubted her compassion. She spoke not as a queen giving orders, but as someone confiding in an old friend. Daniel felt the years between them fade. The girl he had once saved was still there beneath the crown and robes, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt that perhaps he was not so ordinary after all.